Everyone remembers E.T. phoning home and Luke Skywalker saving the galaxy. But today, we're going beyond the blockbusters to 10 sci-fi gems from the 80s that Hollywood unfairly buried. We've got Sean Connery cleaning up crime in space, Dennis Quaid fighting aliens, and a David Cronenberg movie featuring cinema's most infamous exploding head. These films tanked at the box office, confused critics, or just plain vanished, but they're all smarter and way more interesting than the hits you already know. Directed by Wolfgang Petersen, the German filmmaker who did The Boat and The Never-Ending Story, this one's about Dennis Quaid as an Earth pilot named David. He's fighting this big intergalactic war against these aliens called the Dracs, and after a dogfight he crash lands on a hostile planet, alongside the Drac pilot he was fighting. Now they're both stranded, and the only way they can survive is by cooperating. Eventually, David and this alien, played by Louis Gossett Jr., actually become friends. When he dies in childbirth, Dracs reproduce on their own. David has to raise this alien's kid alone. The production was seriously troubled. Petersen only took it over after the original director got fired, costs spiraled, and eventually it completely bombed at the box office. But honestly, it's a thoughtful, really moving story about overcoming prejudice. Quaid and Gossett totally commit, and Gossett's makeup, really impressive for the time, was actually pretty groundbreaking. Too bad hardly anyone actually saw it. Ever since Fantastic Voyage in 1966, the whole miniature people traveling inside the human body thing hasn't really caught on in Hollywood, which is kind of surprising. Anyway, in 1987, Joe Dante, the guy behind movies like The Howling, took another shot at it. Dennis Quaid stars again here. He was basically Mr. Science Fiction in the 80s. This time he plays a pilot who's shrunk down and injected inside Martin Short, who's just a clueless grocery store clerk. Quaid's supposed to protect the shrinking tech from falling into the wrong hands. Originally, it was supposed to be more serious sci-fi, but it turned into a pretty goofy comedy. Like, at one point, Quaid literally exits Martin Short through saliva when Short kisses Meg Ryan, Quaid's girlfriend in the movie. Critics were mostly kind to it, and it even won an Oscar for Best Visual Effects, but it flopped at the box office. Maybe people just don't like thinking about what the inside of their bodies actually look like. This one's seriously wild. Directed by British filmmaker Ken Russell, the guy known for provocative stuff like The Devils and Lair of the White Worm. The screenplay's by Paddy Chayefsky, legendary writer of Network. Chayefsky wrote the original novel too, but apparently he hated Russell's direction so much they had massive clashes. Honestly, who knows what Chayefsky had in mind, but what we ended up with is completely insane. William Hurt, in his first ever movie role, plays a professor obsessed with exploring different states of consciousness. He starts out with these mental journeys, but pretty soon it gets physical, like devolving physically back to primitive stages of humanity, and it just gets crazier from there. The acting's great here, but what makes it unforgettable is Russell's totally bonkers direction. You've got William Hurt turning into everything from a caveman to literal primordial slime. It's exhausting, mind-bending, completely bizarre, and kind of brilliant at the same time. This movie's hardly known in America, but it's super ahead of its time. It stars Harvey Keitel as a guy with a secret camera literally implanted behind his eyes. He works for a TV network that films people's lives without them knowing it, and he's assigned to follow this woman played by Romy Schneider who's dying from an incurable disease. Initially, she agreed to make a reality show about her final months, but then she backed out and fled. Keitel secretly tracks her down, keeps filming, and the network keeps broadcasting it anyway. The story's even sadder, knowing Schneider herself died young, just 2 years after this movie came out. Watching it today, it's weirdly accurate. Totally nails how reality TV would later become so invasive, so obsessed with showing every moment of our lives. Definitely a slow-burn, very European sci-fi movie, not action-packed at all, but still seriously impressive how it predicted today's obsession with cameras always being on us everywhere. Sean Connery was kinda lost after he finished his Bond movies. Remember Zardoz? But here, he actually redeems himself with something pretty cool. It's basically a space version of High Noon set on a mining colony on Jupiter's moon. Connery plays a marshal who's sent there to keep the peace. He quickly finds out the whole place is completely corrupt, dangerous, and he can't trust anybody. It was directed by Peter Hyams, who wrote the script too. Hyams always had a knack for gritty, tough guy movies, and Outland openly leans into its western roots. The mining colony's basically the old frontier, except on Jupiter's moon. And Connery is really solid in this role. Tough, no nonsense. Basically the character he perfected later in The Untouchables. After Star Wars came out, there were obviously going to be a ton of movies trying to cash in on that success. This one definitely does that, but it also borrows a lot from Tron. Basically, you've got this kid named Alex. He's a teenager, lives in a trailer park, spends his time playing this arcade game. Turns out the guy who made the game is actually an alien who's using it to secretly recruit pilots for a real intergalactic war. This was actually just the second big movie, after Tron, to rely heavily on CGI for special effects. Directed by Nick Castle, who's actually better known as the original Michael Myers from Halloween, the movie starred mostly unknown actors with a few familiar character faces sprinkled in. Obviously, Last Starfighter wouldn't exist without Star Wars. Just like George Lucas borrowed from Flash Gordon, this movie borrowed from Lucas. But it actually has a charm of its own. Moves pretty fast, aimed squarely at kids. Didn't do great at the box office back then, but now it's got a nice nostalgic cult following. Believe it or not, Cocoon was almost directed by Robert Zemeckis. Fox execs got nervous after seeing an early cut of his Romancing the Stone, which, funny enough, ended up being a hit anyway. So instead, they gave it to Ron Howard, fresh off the success of Splash. Turned out to be the perfect decision. The story's basically about some seniors living in a retirement home who stumble across a pool with mysterious cocoons that end up having some kind of fountain of youth effect. It's honestly a pretty thoughtful film. Aging, youth, death, big themes handled really well through these older characters. Special effects, especially glowing aliens, might seem dated now, sure, but they still hold up pretty well for the time. Audiences loved it. Big box office hit. Unfortunately, Fox did make a sequel a few years later called Cocoon: The Return. No Ron Howard, no real magic, basically flopped. But this original still really stands out. Right after making Gremlins, Joe Dante decided to try a Spielberg-ish sci-fi fantasy about a group of kids, played by Ethan Hawke and River Phoenix, both making their very first movie appearances here, and Jason Presson. These kids literally build their own spaceship using junk and computer know-how from Phoenix's character. First half of the film is honestly great. Just these kids hanging out, building stuff, taking their ship for little spins around the neighborhood. Hawke and Phoenix are clearly talented even then. You can see why they became stars. But where it kind of loses steam is when they actually get to space. The aliens they meet there are honestly kind of goofy. Not really the payoff you want after that strong setup. It bombed pretty hard back then. Audiences didn't love that second half, but it's still worth a watch today. Stanley Kubrick's A Space Odyssey was basically untouchable, a masterpiece full of ambiguity. When author Arthur C. Clarke wrote a sequel book called 2010, a lot of people thought he was nuts. But Peter Hyams made the film anyway, and actually pulled it off pretty well. It's about a joint US-Soviet mission led by Roy Scheider, heading back into space to figure out what the hell happened to the original Discovery mission. And yeah, we do find out more about the aliens around Jupiter, the spaceship crew, and a bunch of other mysteries from the first movie. Of course it's not Kubrick level, how could it be? But honestly, it's a genuinely solid sci-fi flick. Good cast, Scheider, John Lithgow, Bob Balaban, Helen Mirren, all great. Solid science, smart script, real sense of awe in some scenes. Didn't exactly set the box office on fire, mostly because it's tough to follow a classic, but all things considered, it's pretty impressive. David Cronenberg had already made 6 movies before Scanners, but this was actually his first real hit, even though it was a small one. Basically, it's about a shady security company that's trying to track down and use super dangerous telepaths called scanners. Of course, the scanners themselves have completely different plans. This was Cronenberg's most ambitious film at the time, tons of elaborate sequences and big, gruesome effects. Critics didn't exactly love it when it came out, but fans couldn't stop talking about the imagery, like the iconic exploding head scene or the nasty psychic showdown at the end. It wasn't a huge box office hit, but it made enough to finally get Cronenberg noticed and set him up for bigger success down the line. Today, people recognize it more for what it is, an intense, smart, twisted sci-fi horror flick that explores stuff like human evolution, drugs, and the boundaries of the mind.